So as we all know, every product starts as an idea, one that gets processed, tested, and refined over and over until it's ready for launch. And with League Champions, it's no different. Look at, for example, this concept and selection stage to see what Yorick's Maiden were supposed to look like. Now look at these art options for the Maiden of the Mist. Notice that in option B, we have this ghost-like humanoid silhouette that's giving dead bride vibes with a crown on her head, and it would have actually been Isolde in her undead form. Of course, the most monstrous result was chosen, which is kinda awesome, since Riot hardly ever goes for stuff that's truly scary, especially these days. But like, what about these Viego designs? Like seriously, just so all of you understand, most of the concepts made for Viego showed him looking close to Saruman from the Lord of the Rings, or like some draconic chimeric monster, and all sorts of wild stuff. Like that one in the top left corner, for example, where he's drawn with more and his own sword stuck right into himself. I actually think this one might even been where they got the idea for Otacon down the line. But definitely the most sinister of them all, the one that deserved to be chosen, is in the Ruined King art book, showing Viego with a look that's like some crazy mashup of the Lich King from World of Warcraft and Mordekaiser after his rework. And you can literally see and feel the character's presence and the deep grief he has for his dead queen, since Viego would be using Isolde's own grave as his sword. Just freaking awesome. Like, are you kidding me? How did they scrap that design? But it wasn't just the crazy visuals for Viego that Riot threw out. As far as we know, according to the wiki, there were 4 abilities that were actually worked on at some point during the character's creation. So let's talk about them. First, there's this ability that would let him possess allies and move them around the map. I mean, yeah, I get why they cut this one, because a lot of people would definitely troll with it. It's like an even more problematic version of Tom Kinch's old W, where he swallowed allies and gave them move speed. Another tested ability would have been where Viego created pools of black mist. There isn't a ton of info on what these pools would have done, but I'd guess they'd either buff Viego if he went through them, or do some kind of DPS and apply a debuff to enemies. And like, maybe these pools would have worked kind of like the miasma that Cassiopeia throws out. They also tested an ability that would let Viego walk through walls with the black mist, which I honestly thought was kind of lame and repetitive, since they already had Kayn at that time. So it would have just been a blatant Control-C and Control-V. And then finally, there was a passive where he would start the game with Blade of the Ruined King in his inventory. The item would have had its old slow passive, and Viego would have to collect souls to power it up. That would have also changed his sword visually, starting as a small dagger that eventually became his current blade. That, out of everything listed, actually seems really sick, and something that would have been worth having in the game. But now that you all get it, let's go take a look at some other champions and abilities that Riot scrapped, because in many cases, they would have honestly been better than what we ended up with today. Let's go. A shaman/exorcist. Yeah, Riot almost made a champion with this exact theme. This concept was created around the initial production time for Lilia, and the one who did it was Rioter Jim Lonewingy Lim, who has played a big role in creating a bunch of champions and skins. The core idea they had was that Lilia would be a kind of impatient shape-shifting hunter, and from that, Lim drew up 3 concepts. The first one was a shy priestess, but with an assassin side. Basically, she would have been like Yor from Spy X Family. Her clothes give off a very Ionian vibe, though it could be from Targon too. The middle one was a shy fawn-like fairy whose mood could actually change the seasons. So the first one with hair more like a mane would be like summer, and the second one maybe autumn or winter, I don't know. And we know that that was the one that ended up getting chosen in the end. But the third and final concept is this wandering shaman/exorcist with a dark side. And she would be this girl in a coat carrying a freaking huge pipe as a weapon. What's super cool is that since she's basically a shaman, it totally justifies the use of the pipe, because many healers and shamans from different cultures actually use pipes in ritualistic healing, meditation, or even ceremony. And from what it looks like, this version of Lilia would have had smoke be a part of her gameplay instead of that sleepy dust, but she probably would still do DPS with her attacks. For abilities, I pictured Lilia taking a big puff and then exhaling smoke that would fly forward like a cloud. And if there was something that made her create smoke beings out of the fog, kind of like what Morel from Hunter x Hunter does, that would be so freaking sick. But here's the problem. A few years back, League went through this censorship thing where Graves had his cigar removed from his splash art because of some kind of anti-smoking policy, and how that could somehow be seen as encouraging people to smoke. It was nonsense and really idiotic, but that's actually how one of the oldest memes in the community was born, where people would say anything that happened or was done with a character was okay, except for Graves' cigar and splash art. Like an example. Yeah, they showed an Arcane Vi kissing Caitlyn's while the sheriff was eye-rolling, but Graves still couldn't have his stupid cigarette in the splash art. Anyway, if Shaman Lilia were real, people would be out here saying they want a skin of her with a hookah or even a vape, and everyone would be making memes and even commission art about it. Now, getting back to the abilities in that shaman/exorcist vibe, it would have been so sick if in her kit, like her ultimate, she could seal an enemy foe for a couple seconds. In terms of lore, I'd start saying that Big Pipe Lilia would be from Freljord, since those thick fur coat style clothes give the idea that she's from a cold place. Plus, that region is where you see a lot of tribal shaman stuff the most. About that dark past they said she have, who knows what they were thinking. Maybe Shaman Exorcist Lilia would have been like a John Constantine type of deal, which honestly would have been sick. And while you're down there, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and consider becoming a member. You get access to a bunch of cool perks like choosing video topics or watching videos early. Anyways, back to it. The Ink Muse. This concept was thought up for Nico as one of the possible directions she could have gone during her creation. The story we have, according to the wiki, is that Nico would have been a girl or a woman made of ink, meaning she was literally a character created inside a painting, but who come to life and step out of her own artwork. And the other idea was that she would have been some kind of avant-garde oracle. Don't ask me what that is. I even googled it trying to figure out what it could mean. The most plausible explanation I found is that she'd be a super wise and innovative person who was ahead of her time. But going back to the ink thing, there's a good chance that this ink muse Nico was somehow connected to the old ink mage Riot tried to make, where we have a mechanic to draw patterns and shapes with a mouse that would activate the character's ability. In the research I found, like in the video playing right now, for example, they said they wanted to turn the ink mage into a support champion, and that his ultimate would be like drawing a square around the enemy champion, and with that, he'd activate the magic reshaping the terrain so the opponent would get stuck inside. And just to be clear, I'm only saying could have been because it's more likely that the ink mage eventually became Hui, the codename they used while he was being produced. Either way, even though Nico is already a pretty cool champion with good gameplay and a fun theme, this other possibility would have been really creative too, but I have no complaints. The current Nico is pretty awesome. Watcher Offspring. It's hard to get something from the Void in League because Riot has straight up said that really monstrous champions don't do well in terms of popularity or how they fit into this skin ecosystem. And on top of that, they tend to cater hard toward the Asian server players who love more generic standard looks. So obviously they're gonna prioritize what makes the most money and keeps that economy moving. But during the production of Neferi, we got introduced to the idea of having a champion more than linked to the Void. This concept was actually supposed to be a spawn of a Frozen Watcher. Just to remind you, Frozen Watchers are basically the leaders of the Void, like the big bosses of all that madness. They're these ancient cosmic beings from the Void itself, and they pretty much ruled over all of the Voidborn. So the idea was that this kid, this offspring of the Frozen Watcher, would hail from the Freljord, obviously since that's where a significant part of the Watchers are frozen and stuck into deep slumber under the ice. The whole vibe for this baby Watcher was that it was meant to represent and channel the idea of a Freljord Cerberus, like a three-headed mythological beast, but in the style of Runeterra's icy void touch lore. That same image I showed earlier makes it seem like this Watcher spawn would have been able to project multiple heads with jaws to attack. And since the Void is utterly grotesque with its alien and cosmic horror aesthetic, like what we've seen hinted with champions like Rek'Sai and Bel'Veth, let's not talk about Kai'Sa, they could have leaned into the whole idea of this Watcher child creating extra heads and limbs mid-fight, maybe stacking damage or multiplying attack effects based on how many it summoned. And almost definitely its gameplay would have involved true ice or black ice, since in lore that's what happens when a Watcher's magic corrupts regular ice. It turns into this twisted, corrupted ice that has its own unique power and horror to it. Honestly, having something this deeply connected to the Watchers in League would have been so cool, because the most we've ever really seen of a Watcher in official media was in Legends of Runeterra and the little animation showing one breaking free with some giant eye beam or whatever. But feeling like you could actually have one of those things in the game would have been way cooler than even what we got with the Neferi. As for how its lore might have worked, well, in the short story The Legend of the Frozen Watchers, it said that the boldest of the Watchers once hurled themselves into the physical world of Runeterra from the Void, even though they didn't understand the material plane or even what it meant to have a form or constant existence. When they hit Runeterra, their bodies kind of exploded into shape. from formless tentacles into full limbs with joints and fingers, horns, and fur, all completely confused by going from non-existence into reality. That's the same basic appearance you see in Legends of Runeterra. Anyway, it was at that moment of the invasion that Lysandra sacrificed her sisters and both of their armies alongside with the magic stolen from the Yetis to freeze the Watchers and stop their advance into Runeterra, because otherwise, that would have been the end of everything. It's very possible that before being completely frozen, the first Watcher, realizing it was about to be trapped, reacted quickly and tore off a piece of itself, like the tip of a finger, and hurled it far beyond reach of Lysandra's magic, so at least that part of it could escape and remain free. And knowing how the void works with assimilation, that piece, once it landed somewhere, probably assimilated some kind of wolf or dog from that region that got too close, replicating its form, even if in a grotesque way. And man, it would have been insane if in its ultimate, the Watcher offspring revealed more of its true monstrous form. And for sure, this Watcher offspring would have the mission of freeing the other Watchers, but it would have been interesting if instead it decided to explore the world more and feed on it rather than fulfill that main objective. In the end, it would kind of be like a rebellious and negligent child compared to the will of its parents. And that's possible since the void constantly changes even in its essence, the more contact it has with reality. I mean, we've got a champion all about that in Rek'Sai.
A beast of motherly instinct. The Watchers did not anticipate this.
Even though she's one of the oldest void spawn we know of, Rek'Sai deviated from her original purpose of creation, like the voice line you just heard suggests. In other words, Rek'Sai ends up acting much more like an animal from our world, replicating instinctive maternal behavior. Bel'Veth herself is also an evolution of the void, since she seeks out to destroy the world, using it as a base and fuel to create a new one, where everything that exists is only her lavender sea, which is a total abomination in the eyes of the Watchers. That's because the void is not meant to exist. Its whole thing is just returning the world to non-existence. In short, they are meant to destroy reality, not cling to it and reshape it in their own image. Now, another interesting concept that Neferi almost had was a drakehound. And for those who don't know, the drakehound is a species distantly related to dragons, completely carnivorous and wingless, about the size of wolves. They originated in the mountains north of Nexus, where territory was scarce and competition was intense. Wild packs of these drakehounds were known to hunt and migrate across parts of the Noxian Empire, with some inhabiting the mountains in the southern region of the Great Barrier. Noxians used domesticated drakehounds as war beasts, guard animals, herders, and as expensive pets. It's almost like those Arab sheiks who keep a lion as a symbol of wealth and power. And while Neferi would probably have been a drakehound trained by the Noxian Empire, in the concept image, it shows that this drakehound would have wielded a double blade, holding it in its mouth by biting down at the base of the handle, and she would spin with that blade at high speed, turning into some kind of propeller. I know what you're thinking, but that's not exactly like Garen. Instead, you can think of something closer to the wolf fang over fang jutsu from Kaiba and Akamaru. By the way, did you know that in the Mbessa book, it's revealed that during her adulthood, Mbessa learned how to handle drakehounds after capturing the matriarch of a pack? And here's the cool part, it also says that Mbessa has two of the matriarch's pups, calling them Quench and Temper, and both are her loyal companions until death. Now, the last example of what Neferi could have been involves the concept of a retriever tied to the sun and the moon. Basically, the perfect dog for Diana and Leona. And if that direction had gone forward, it's likely that this celestial retriever could have been a being meant to show the stubborn Solari that the moon is just as important as the sun, and that both need to coexist, instead of having only one side dominate and radically deny the other. But the coolest thing we've ever had to a dog tied to Targon was the card The Messenger in Legends of Runeterra, which comes with a little story connected to the song about the seasons that says, "As leaves unfurl from the barren branches, the Lady of Spring sends her messenger to inform the Lord of the Winter of the changing season. The messenger's bark startles the stars into new places in the sky, while his loyal heart warms the land." Discarded champion abilities. Here we're going to take a look at some discarded abilities from champions that are already in the game. Some of the abilities tested for Mbessa during development included something similar to Doomfist's ultimate in Overwatch, where she would have leapt into the air and chose where she was going to land, dealing massive damage when she hit the ground. There was also a version of her W that actually made it into the game in testing, except in that version she became immune to crowd control effects. And you guys remember how before his ASU, Ezreal's W used to be complete trash and only only worked if you went full AP, it was so heavily criticized that Riot knew they had to remove it and give him something new. But before they landed on his current Essence Flux, they tested the idea of making his W a short-range attack that would knock the target back. Crazy. Next up is Wei. During his development and testing phase, one of his abilities planned for his W would have him draw a rain cloud over himself, and because of that he'd become even more depressed while also turning invisible. And for this one, you might want to pause the video, go to the bathroom, grab some water, or maybe even a snack, because listen to this. Mordekaiser had 12 freaking abilities tested during his rework process. The first one on the list was a tested version of his passive where Mordekaiser would enslave the souls of enemies he killed in game. They basically took his old pre-work ultimate where he would kind of curse an enemy and they'd have that Mordekaiser head icon floating above them, taking damage over time like a long-lasting ignite. And if the enemy died, you'd capture their soul and control it, basically gaining an extra champion on your team. And just to remind you, Riot even buffed that later by letting Mordekaiser use his ult on the dragon. And if it died while marked, you'd take the dragon soul and turn it into your pet, bringing it to lane with you. The second one was also related to his passive. Mordekaiser would have a very low attack speed, but consecutive hits with his mace would increase his attack speed, extend his basic attack range, and eventually involve his mace into a flail. The third was a version of his Q where his mace could transform into a flail and embed itself into the ground. Mordekaiser could then cast the ability again and get a different effect depending on the position of the weapon's head in relation to him. The fourth was a version of his W where Mordekaiser would enter a spectral form and become untargetable, but he wouldn't be able to auto-attack, kind of like Senna's E. During that time, he would feel weightless and float as if he was suddenly weighed nothing, based on the idea that his physical manifestation in the world is temporary. The fifth was also a tested version of his W where Mordekaiser would gain additional resistances based on nearby enemies and become immune to slows. The sixth was an ability where Mordekaiser would fire a slow circular projectile that would kind of tear open a rift into the Death Realm. The seventh was a different version of the Realm of Death, his ultimate. In this one, Mordekaiser would create a portal around himself and the target, and after a few seconds, it would drag everyone into the Death Realm to fight there. The eighth one was that when Mordekaiser used his ultimate, he would create two objects similar to Thresh's lantern, and if other players clicked them, those artifacts would act as a gateway to the Death Realm, allowing teammates to join the fight. The ninth would let Mordekaiser fire a missile projectile like Urgot's ultimate, and if the missile hit the target, it would automatically drag them into the Death Realm. The 10th would allow Mordekaiser to stay in his spirit form, and the first enemy who touched his spirit would be sent to the Death Realm. The 11th was also related to the Death Realm area. In this idea, there would be a barrier around it, basically a damage zone, that would deal heavy damage over time if the enemy tried to leave. It's like trying to walk through the enemy fountain or trying to step through Aurora's ultimate. And finally, the 12th one, where during his ultimate, Mordekaiser's stat steal would increase with ult rank ups to a whole 30%. Senna also had several abilities considered during her kit development, but not nearly as many as Mordekaiser. The first was a version where she wielded two pistols that had 500 range, probably meant to evoke Lucian's fighting style. The second was a version of her ultimate that allowed her to use a teleport after each attack. The third was a version of her passive that granted infinitely stacking % max health damage, and the fourth involved her Q, allowing Senna to heal minions and turrets, which is honestly pretty busted. And speaking of busted things, check this one out. Apparently, during Yunara's production, she had a passive where whenever an enemy she hadn't seen for about 10 seconds entered a certain range but stayed outside her vision, a bell would ring and reveal all nearby enemies. Oh, and as a bonus, in her early concepts, Yunara was supposed to be a Bat-Vastaya inventor from Piltover who created weapons. The other version, the one that ended up being chosen, was a priestess meant to be a kind of anti-Syndra. You can see that her look was different and that she was an archer. In the end, Riot probably moved that visual direction to create Ash's Spirit Blossom skin. We also have Zoe. This one would have been absolutely insane, I'm telling you. Maybe newer players don't remember, but a few years ago, the ADCs went through a pretty significant rework, and one of them was Corki. After a certain amount of time in the match, a side mission would pop up where Corki had to go back to base and grab a package that gave a massive buff to his W. It also boosted his speed, if I'm not mistaken. So some Rioter during Zoe's development thought it would be cool to recreate something like that, where Zoe would go back to base, pick up a huge water balloon, and when she popped it, it would flood a huge part of the jungle and put multiple enemies who got hit to sleep. It's basically a Doombot version of her E. If the version we have is already annoying, imagine her throwing a full-on sleep Genki Dama at you. I'm actually tired now after all that. But that's it for today. I'll see you guys in the next video.